So the next few videos are all about lenses. In this one, I'm going to talk about different focal lengths. I'm going to talk about prime and zoom lenses. I'm going to talk about what happens if you use the same lens on different size sensors, and also why lenses are generally a better investment than cameras and which ones you should start with. Now, when I mention in the video that I'm going to talk about maximum aperture in a moment, what I really mean is in a video in a few weeks' time, because this series of videos wasn't originally intended for free release on YouTube. This video and all the others in the series are part of my Technical Fundamentals course, which is a complete beginner's guide to all the technical aspects of photography. Stay tuned every week for more info. So far I've covered exposure, resolution, all that sort of thing. There's a few more bits and pieces to come. And obviously if you like what I'm doing, stick like, comment if you've got any questions, subscribe to get notifications. But without mucking about anymore, let's get stuck into the basics of lenses. So lenses, first bit of equipment we need to talk about after cameras. First thing you'll notice about a lens, probably the most important thing I suppose, is the focal length. Okay, this will be a number, should be pretty prominent. It's usually what the lens is listed as. It'll be a 50mm, an 85mm, etc, etc. What that tells you is, broadly speaking, the angle of view you're going to get. Okay, with a small number, so let's say a 35mm lens, you have a fairly wide angle of view. With a large number, let's say 200mm lens, you have a narrow angle of view. Okay, fairly straightforward that really. One thing you need to know though is that focal length is related in some way to sensor size. This means that the normal view, what we would accept as being close to our regular human vision when we bring the camera to our eye, will vary depending on what sensor size you've got. The sort of industry standard, broadly speaking, is our old friend the full frame digital SLR. Don't forget this is based on the dimensions of a 35mm camera, which goes back decades and decades and decades. Normal view on that is around 50mm. That's a 50mm lens. If the sensor is smaller than that, then normal view will also be a smaller focal length. For example, the normal view on this compact, the normal sort of angle of view you're looking for, will be a focal length of something like, it's about 12 to 15mm. Okay, and for something like a smartphone, even smaller. And by comparison, if you have a much larger image sensor, like our friend here, the normal angle of view is somewhere around 150mm. Okay, that's one of the first things to get in your mind, is that focal length will not always look the same on a different sensor. Okay, and it becomes an issue because we have here two cameras which can both take the same lenses but have got different size sensors. Now it's unlikely you're going to take the same lens from a camera like this and suddenly put it on one of those or try and stick it on your camera phone. But where it can happen is where you have, say, two camera bodies which both take the same lenses. One has got a full frame sensor and one has got a smaller sensor. This lens is designed to work primarily with a full frame sensor camera, like this one. Okay, so it is focusing the light in and then projecting that light back out on the image sensor to cover an area, let's say that wide, hypothetically. Okay. If you then put behind it a sensor that's only this wide, because we know this sensor is smaller, you've effectively cropped into the center of the image you're seeing. You haven't actually made the lens longer, although it may appear like that when you bring it to your eye and suddenly you're seeing less of the scene. You've literally just cropped in by using a smaller sensor. Okay. Correspondingly, of course, that means if you want to get a wide angle shot with a smaller sensor, you're going to need quite a small focal length lens, which can get quite tricky. On the plus side, of course, if you're trying to do long lens work and you want to see something further away, well, you kind of have an advantage in that you're cropping into the image in the first place. So what's a 200mm lens might end up being a 300mm in terms of how it crops into what you're actually seeing. Sticking with focal lengths, there are, broadly speaking, two types of lens. There are prime lenses, which have just one focal length, so an 85mm or a 50mm, and then there are zoom lenses, which cover a range of focal lengths. For example, this one is a 16 to 35, 16 at that end, 35 at that end, and this one is an 18 to 200. It's quite frightening, that. Now obviously, a zoom lens allows you to cover a range of focal lengths. That's surely really versatile and really useful, so why on earth do I still own lenses like this. Well, of course, there's a catch, isn't there? There's always a catch. We know the game by now. So as always, here are the simple pros and cons. A prime lens, obviously, has a fixed focal length. That's the big drawback. Okay, you've only got the one angle of view. If you want to get more in shot, you need to walk backwards. If you want to get closer in, you need to walk closer in. That's the drawback. On the plus side, they pretty much always have a faster maximum aperture than a zoom lens does. I'll go into more detail about why that's good in just a moment. They are still, even nowadays, better optical quality, in my opinion and in my experience. Okay, zooms are pretty decent nowadays. Certainly expensive zooms give you pretty decent optical quality. Primes still have the edge. Also, primes are often smaller and lighter than zooms, and that can have an advantage, there's no doubt about it. I often spend hours and hours and hours with my camera bodies attached to me, and saving a few grams here and there, yeah, it doesn't sound like much, it adds up over the course of a day. Now zooms, by comparison, yeah, the big plus is the versatility. Obviously you put it on the camera and you can cover a whole range of focal lengths. Fantastic. The biggest drawback, pretty much every single time with a zoom, is you're going to have a much slower maximum aperture. Again, explain why in just a minute. The optical quality won't be quite as good. They can get very big and heavy, okay, which really is an issue. They can also be, certainly for higher quality ones, very, very expensive. Don't get me wrong, the very, very highest quality prime lenses can get very expensive, but you can pick up an extremely high quality prime lens for a remarkably small amount of money. By comparison, a very, very high quality zoom lens is going to set you back well into four figures. So there's a place for both in your camera bag, no doubt about it. As a working professional, I own 4 zooms, 3 of which I use regularly, 1 of which I use occasionally when circumstances demand it, and I have 3 prime lenses. Now I would use my primes as much as possible because I simply prefer working with them. However, I have to be reasonable and practical, and they're not always the best option if I'm somewhere cramped with a limited amount of space. A zoom can be a much better option, or if I'm photographing a fast-moving subject, a live sports event, a zoom can be much more useful. So they definitely have their use. If you're just starting out, I would suggest probably get a decent zoom to begin with, a zoom that covers a useful range of focal lengths. Don't get too worried about the aperture just yet because you can end up spending a fortune. But as soon as you've got the money, you might want to go and get yourself a nice 50mm f1.8 of whichever camera manufacturer you own a camera for, because that will set you back probably not much more than about £100, and suddenly you'll have a very fast lens of extremely good optical quality. The other important principle about equipment, I may go into this in more depth further down the course, is lenses are something you can invest in. The technology in lenses doesn't get superseded very often at all. Some of the lenses that I use have been around for donkey's years. I've been using them for donkey's years, whereas camera bodies, the technology in those gets replaced and gets updated all the time. A camera body from 3 or 4 years ago can be quite far behind in terms of tech related to one that comes out today, whereas these lenses don't really go out of fashion. They're worth investing in much more than camera bodies are. There you go, the absolute basics of lenses. Next week, I'm going to talk about lenses outside the norm, like wide angle and telephoto and some specialist ones. But in the meantime, hit like if you like what I'm doing, comment below, subscribe, you know how YouTube works, and I'll see you next week.